They didn't burn the dogs because they were starving. They burned them because something was following the smell. It was March 1921 on the northern edge of Franz Josef land, flat white ice under a low sky, the kind of landscape that turns distance into a lie. The expedition's camp was a small, desperate stain on the horizon. 2 canvas tents, a sled, fuel tins, and a circle of men whose beards had grown into their collars. The dogs were tethered in a line downwind. 8 of them. Strong, half-wild animals with frost on their whiskers, trained to pull until their paws bled and then pull again. That morning the dogs refused to bark. Not quiet from discipline. Quiet the way animals go quiet when they can't afford to make themselves known. Expedition leader Dr. Orlov stepped out with a lantern still lit against daylight, habit, not necessity, and saw the first sign. A shallow trench in the snow, running parallel to camp, as if something heavy had dragged itself close in the night and then turned away. No paw prints. No claw marks. Just that long, smooth groove. He crouched and touched the edge of it with his glove. The snow there was crushed hard, glazed slightly, pressure and warmth, then cold. As if the thing that made it carried heat and weight far beyond what the Arctic should permit. Behind him, one of the handlers whispered, "Bear." Orlov didn't answer. Bears leave tracks. Bears leave evidence that a man can pretend to understand. This left only shape. And shape is what the mind fears when it has no names left. Then the dogs began to whine. Not a chorus, just one, the lead animal, throat tight. Orlov turned. The dog wasn't looking out across the open ice. It was looking down, at the snow beneath its own paws. The dog pulled back on its tether, nails scraping, and the rope drew a taut line into the drift as if the ground itself was resisting. Then the ice under the dog's feet exhaled. A faint puff of powdery snow rose as if something beneath had displaced air upward. The dog screamed once and was yanked sideways so fast the line snapped tight enough to crack like a rifle shot. Men rushed forward, knives out, shouting. And in that chaos, Orlov saw it. Not the whole animal. A pale curve rising under the snow in a slow arc, like a shoulder pushing beneath a sheet. A body moving under the surface. A bear that didn't need to appear to hunt. The handler reached the dog and tried to cut it free. Too late. The line went taut again. The dog vanished under the snow as if swallowed. No blood. No struggle visible. Just a sudden empty space where an animal had been, and a drift settling closed over it like water. Silence followed. Not calm. A listening silence. Then from somewhere out beyond sight, a deep low huff rolled across the ice. Not loud. Not angry. A confirmation. Orlov's hand shook as he stood. He looked at the remaining dogs, still tethered, still alive, still smelling like meat and fear. And he made the decision that would be written later in a clipped, shameful line in the expedition record. Destroyed sled dogs by fire to prevent further tracking. If you click away now, you keep the comforting version of polar horror. Cold, starvation, human error. But if you stay, you'll follow why educated men trained to endure, chose to burn their own animals alive in the open Arctic. Because something out there wasn't simply hunting them. It was reading their camp like a map. And in the white, a map is the only thing that makes you die on schedule. Franz Josef Land is not a place. It's an absence. A scattering of icebound islands in the far north, where the sea becomes solid for months and the sky stays the color of bone. In 1921, it was still a frontier for national pride and scientific ambition, a blank on maps that men in warm offices wanted to fill with measurements. Dr. Pavel Orlov had been sent north with a mixed purpose, to collect meteorological data, verify shoreline features, and establish a temporary observation camp before returning south at the seasonal break. Officially, it was a routine scientific effort. In practice, it was the same old human mistake, mistaking a blank space on paper for an empty place in reality. Orlov's party was small, as most serious Arctic expeditions were after the war. Funding thin, equipment rationed, men chosen for toughness rather than comfort. Dr. Orlov, leader and medic, rational, exact, and increasingly haunted. Semyon Krutov, dog handler, short, scarred hands, knows animals better than people. Lars Nygaard, Norwegian ice pilot hired for his knowledge of flows and weather. Mikkel Durov, radio operator with a portable set that only worked when the atmosphere allowed it. Two general hands, whose names appear only rarely in the notes, because the Arctic reduces identity to function. They landed by sled and small boat as far as ice would permit, then pushed inland to build camp in a shallow windbreak near a pressure ridge. They chose the site for the same reasons men always choose sites: shelter, visibility, and a belief they could control what approached. They were wrong. The first week was hard but normal. They recorded temperatures and wind. They cut snow blocks for walls. They rationed fuel. They rotated watch at night, not because they expected attack, but because the cold punishes sleep. Polar bears were part of the calculation, but manageable in theory. Keep food sealed, keep rifles close, keep dogs tied downwind. And for a while it worked. Then the dogs began to behave as if the camp had become prey. They stopped fighting each other. They stopped barking at distant shapes. They began to tuck their tails and stare at empty ice like something was standing there. Krutov noticed first. "These dogs," he told Orlov quietly, "they've seen something before." Orlov frowned. "A bear." Krutov shook his head once. "A bear leaves you a story," he said. "This leaves them silence." That night Nygaard heard the first sound. Not a roar. A low, slow breathing sound from the dark beyond the pressure ridge, like someone sleeping in the open. Nygaard sat up in his sleeping bag, listening until his ears hurt. Then the sound stopped, and the dogs downwind went perfectly still. The Arctic can be quiet in a natural way. This was quiet in a deliberate way, as if sound itself had been turned off by an intelligence that understood what sound does to men. At dawn they found the trench. A long, smooth groove in the snow running around camp just outside Lantern Range. It was shallow, but it was wide, too wide to be a sled runner, too smooth to be wind. Nygaard knelt and measured it with his hands. "Something dragged," he said. Orlov stared at it. "Dragged what?" he asked. Nygaard didn't answer, because the answer was worse than any guess. If something was being dragged that close to camp, it meant the creature wasn't afraid of men. It meant it had approached and withdrawn on its own terms. And then they found the second sign. Small, neat holes in the snow at regular intervals along the trench, like someone had poked the surface with a rounded tool. Krutov studied them, face tight. "It's testing," he said. "Testing what?" Orlov asked. Krutov looked at the tent line. "Testing where the smell is strongest," he said. "Testing where we sleep." Imagine that. An animal not circling randomly, but sampling the perimeter. Not hunting by sight. Hunting by information. The men didn't say it aloud, but the hierarchy formed in their minds anyway. Camp. Dogs. Men. And something beyond the ridge deciding the order. They reinforced. Of course they reinforced. Men build walls when they don't know what else to do. They raised snow blocks around the dog line. They double-tethered the animals. They moved meat farther from camp and buried scraps deep. Nygaard wanted to move camp entirely. Orlov refused. "The radio only has one good clear line from here," Orlov said. "We move and we lose contact." Durov, the radio man, nodded grimly. Atmosphere been bad. If we miss the next window. Orlov's voice went hard. We won't. So they stayed. That's the other trap in the Arctic, logistics. It keeps you fixed in a place, long after your instincts tell you the place has been chosen for your death. That afternoon, Krutov tried to calm the dogs with touch and voice, moving along the line, kneeling by each animal. Most of them wouldn't meet his eyes. Then the lead dog, old and smart, began to whine again. "K." Krutov followed its gaze and saw nothing. Just snow. Just a slight rise in the drift beside the tether posts. He stepped closer, boots crunching. The dog strained backward, throat vibrating. Krutov reached for its collar. The drift beside them moved. Not settling. Moving like a body shifting under a blanket. Krutov froze, hands still in the air. Orlov shouted from the tent entrance, "Krutov." Krutov didn't answer. He stared at the snow, and for a second the Arctic did the impossible. It suggested something alive beneath it. The drift bulged slightly. Then a pale shape pressed up under the surface, smooth and curved. Not a paw. Not a muzzle. A shoulder. A back. Something immense sliding through snow like water. Krutov yanked the dog's tether hard, trying to drag it away. The rope went taut. The snow beneath the dog's feet puffed as if exhaling. Then the dog vanished. Swallowed clean, pulled under as if the ice had opened its mouth and closed again. Krutov stumbled backward, screaming the dog's name like it mattered. Orlov and Nygaard ran with rifles raised. But the snow had already settled. No hole, no blood, no tracks. Only a disturbed surface, where the drift had briefly become a throat. And then beyond the ridge, that low huff sounded again. Not triumphant. Patient. Like a man clearing his lungs before beginning work. Orlov's hands shook as he lowered his rifle. He looked at the remaining dogs. He looked at the trench. He looked at the way the snow had swallowed an animal without leaving evidence. And he finally admitted what he'd been refusing since the first groove appeared. This wasn't a bear hunt. It was a method. Something was mapping the camp by scent and tension, and the dogs were a beacon in that map. Krutov stood with his mouth open, eyes wet, face stiff with disbelief. Orlov stepped to him and spoke quietly. "We burned them," he said. Krutov stared at him as if he'd misheard. Orlov's voice stayed flat because if it rose, he wouldn't be able to say it. "We burn the dogs," he repeated, "or we lose all of them, then we lose ourselves." Krutov's breath came in ragged pulls. "Those dogs are how we leave," he whispered. Orlov nodded once. "And their smell is how it finds us," he said. Nygaard looked away, jaw clenched. Durov whispered, "Christ." And the Arctic, indifferent as ever, offered no moral guidance. Only cold. Only time. Only the certainty that if they stayed tethered to their normal plan, the predator beneath the snow would keep taking what was easiest until it reached what it wanted. They didn't hold a meeting about it. A meeting implies debate, and debate implies you still have room to be humane. Out on the ice, with the trench lines circling camp and the snow swallowing dogs without leaving a mouth behind, humanity had become a luxury item, something you ran out of the way you ran out of lamp oil. Krutov stood at the dog line with his hands clenched so hard his nails cut into leather. Orlov watched him from 3 paces away, giving him space the way you give space to a man holding a knife. Nygaard and Durov stayed back near the tents, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't want their bodies to participate in what their minds were already condemning. Krutov finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "You know they don't die quick," he said. Orlov didn't flinch. "I know," he answered. Krudov nodded once, as if confirming something he'd hoped would be denied. He looked at the dogs, 8 shapes hunched in the cold, ribs and muscle and intelligence. They'd stopped whining. They watched the men with an uncanny stillness, as if they understood that a decision had been made above their heads. If you're listening, put yourself there for a second. Imagine being the one holding the fuel tin. Not hungry, not desperate. Just frightened enough to do something that will haunt you even if you survive. Orlov spoke again, low and exact. "We do it downwind," he said. "Farther from camp we do it fast. We do not hesitate." Krudov's eyes flicked to the trench line in the snow. "It's still out there," he said. Orlov nodded. "That's why," he replied. They moved the dogs. Not all at once. One by one, cutting and retying, dragging the tether posts farther out onto a flatter patch of hard snow where the wind would carry the smoke away from the tents. The dogs resisted, not violently, but with a stubborn reluctance that felt like accusation. The lead animal, the old one, refused to walk for a moment. Krudov had to pull, whispering to it like it was human. When the dog finally moved, it kept looking down at the snow beneath its own paws, as if it could feel something shifting underneath, just out of reach of human senses. Orlov watched that and felt his stomach turn. Because if the dogs could sense it under the snow, it meant the thing wasn't simply circling the camp. It was positioning underneath it. They made a small pyre out of broken sled slats and spare packing timber. There wasn't much wood to waste. Nothing in the Arctic is wasted, but the resin in the slats helped the flame catch. Orlov poured lamp oil in a careful circle, rationing even now, because habit doesn't die easily. Krudov had the matchbook in his hand. His fingers shook so hard the match head scraped twice before it lit. For a moment, the small flame looked pathetic against the white world. Then it caught oil and the fire took. It didn't roar like a bonfire. The wind kept it low, flattening it, making it crawl along wood. Krudov looked at Orlov. Orlov nodded once. Krudov went to the first dog. He didn't look into its eyes. He couldn't. He cut the tether and forced the dog close to the fire. The dog fought then, silent, frantic, legs scrabbling, muscles twisting. Orlov heard Nagard swear behind him. Durov made a sound like he was about to vomit. Krudov pressed the dog down with his weight, then released and backed away fast. The dog surged, caught the fire on its fur, and in 1 second it was no longer an animal. It was a torch. The sound it made, half scream, half breath, will stay with you even if you only hear it imagined. The others howled immediately, not in panic at fire, but in recognition of what fire meant. Orlov turned his face away. Not out of cowardice. Out of a need to keep functioning. They did it quickly after that, one then the next, cut, force, retreat. The fire grew hotter, fed by fur and oil and the terrible efficiency of necessity. Smoke rose thick and dark into the Arctic air, a column you could see for miles. And Orlov realized, too late to stop, that they had traded one signal for another. Scent for smoke. They were trying to hide from a thing that hunted by smell. And they had made themselves visible to the entire horizon. Krudov stood shaking, hands open and empty. His face wasn't wet because tears freeze too quickly out here. But his eyes were raw. Orlov stepped close enough to speak without raising his voice. "It's done," he said. Krudov nodded, but he didn't look at Orlov. He looked past him into the white. "That's what you think," he whispered. Then the wind shifted, and the smoke column bent sideways like a finger pointing. Pointing not toward safety. Pointing out over the ice, toward the empty distance where nothing moved. Orlov felt his skin tighten. Because the empty distance suddenly didn't feel empty. It felt occupied. That night the creature changed its behavior. The men expected retaliation. They expected a rush, a surface charge, a huge pale shape appearing out of the dark like an answer to their fire. It didn't come. Instead, they got something worse. No trenches, no grooves. When Orlov stepped out with the lantern at midnight to check the perimeter, he found the snow around camp smooth. Too smooth. The earlier trench line had been softened by wind, yes, but not erased. This looked like the predator had stopped dragging itself close, stopped advertising its path, as if it had decided the game had moved from intimidation to work. Orlov returned to the tent and said quietly, "It's not circling anymore." Nygaard looked up, "Then where is it?" Orlov didn't answer because the answer felt like inviting it inside. Krudov lay on his side back to them, eyes open. "It's under," he said. Durov swallowed. "Under what?" Krudov's voice went flat. "Under the camp," he said. "Under the snow that holds us up." Orlov tried to sleep. He couldn't. The tent felt thinner now, canvas over ribs over a void. And every time the wind eased and the world became quiet enough to hear your own blood, Orlov thought he heard it. A faint, low breathing sound, not outside the tent but beneath the ice. As if the ground had lungs. Just before dawn, the first tent stake pulled free. Not yanked violently. Slid out with a soft whisper of snow, as if a hand beneath had found the line and loosened it carefully. Nygaard woke instantly. Ice men wake to small changes. He sat up. What was that? Orlov held his breath. They heard it again. A second stake loosened. Canvas shifted slightly, losing tension. Durov's voice trembled. "Wind." Nygaard shook his head. "No wind." Krudov sat up slowly, face gray. "It's taking the tension away," he whispered. "It's making the tent fall." Orlov's throat went dry. That was intelligence, not hunger. To collapse shelter in the Arctic is not to kill immediately. It's to let cold do the killing while you conserve effort. Nygaard grabbed his knife and crawled to the tent edge, pressing his ear to the snow-packed skirt. He listened. Then his eyes widened, rare for Nygaard. He backed away from the edge like it burned him. "Something's moving under us," he said. Orlov reached for the lantern and held it low. The canvas floor, thin cloth over packed snow, looked normal. Then near the center, the snow beneath the cloth puffed upward slightly, as if something large had exhaled. A soft dome rose for half a second. Then settled. Not a collapse. A presence. The men froze. No one spoke. Because speaking would mean acknowledging the geometry. They were sleeping above a moving body. Then came the sound. A low, thick huff from outside the tent, close. So close Orlov could feel it in his ribs. Nygaard's eyes snapped to the entrance flap. Orlov didn't move toward it. He didn't want to give the creature a predictable response. Instead, he did something that felt absurd, and yet was the only agency he had left. He extinguished the lantern. Darkness filled the tent instantly. Durov inhaled sharply. Orlov whispered, "No light." In the dark, the creature's huff sounded louder. Then it stopped. Not fading. Stopping. Listening. A long silence. And then from beneath the floor, the snow dome rose again, higher this time, pushing cloth up like a slow fist. The tent's center pole creaked. Krudov whispered, "It's lifting." Orlov felt his heart hammer. If the creature lifted the tent floor enough, it could collapse their pole, bring canvas down, trap them in fabric while the cold and panic did the rest. Nygaard reached for the pole. Orlov grabbed his wrist. "Don't," Orlov hissed, "if it feels movement." Too late. Nygaard's hand touched the pole and shifted it a fraction. The snow under the floor moved immediately, responding to vibration like a hand responding to a tap. The tent lurched sideways, Durov shouted, uncontrolled, and in that shout the world snapped. The canvas floor split at one seam, not tearing like cloth, but separating along a stitch line as if pressure had been applied exactly where the weakness was. A gap opened. Cold air surged in. And in that gap, Orlov saw something pale and furred slide past, so close that the hair brushed the cloth. Not a paw. Not a muzzle. A shoulder again, massive and smooth under fur, moving like a seal under ice. Krudov screamed, "Move!" They scrambled out of the tent in chaos, dragging gear, falling into snow. Outside, dawn was a gray smear. The burned dog pyre was a black mound steaming faintly. The world looked normal until Orlov looked at the ground beside the tent. The snow there was depressed in a wide arc, like a trench made by a body rolling. And within that depression were faint ridges, impressions like thick fur had brushed the surface repeatedly. Nygaard lifted his rifle and aimed at the depression. There was nothing to shoot. Then 5 yards from the tent, the snow rose. Not gradually. A sudden bulge like a whale surfac. Ing! And from that bulge, a bear head emerged. Huge. Broad as a man's chest, fur crusted with ice, muzzle long and blunt. Its eyes were small for its skull, black and deep, and they didn't look rabid or wild. They looked tired. Old. A thing that had survived long enough to learn patience. It exhaled once, a thick cloud of breath, and the smell hit them even in cold air, rancid fat, old blood, wet fur. The polar bear Behemoth. Not a myth. Not a trick of snow. A real body, scaled wrong, moving wrong. It didn't charge. It held still for one long moment, watching men scramble around their fallen shelter like insects around a broken nest. Then it opened its mouth. Not roaring. Just opening. Showing teeth worn blunt at the ends, like tools used against hard things. Teeth designed to crush bone and ice, and whatever else the Arctic offered. Orlov raised his rifle. Nygaard fired first. The shot cracked the morning. The bullet struck the bear's shoulder with a dull thump and a faint puff of snow dust from the fur. The bear barely flinched. It lowered its head slightly, more annoyed than injured, and took one step forward. Krudov whispered, horrified, "It doesn't care." Orlov understood then why it hunted under snow. It didn't need speed. It didn't need theatrics. It could absorb the cost of a shot the way the ice absorbs a footprint. It was built for endurance. Nygaard fired again, aiming for the head. The bear dipped its muzzle and the shot went wide, sparking off ice ridge. Then, with a motion that felt too smooth for something that large, the bear dropped its forequarters and slid forward, half swimming, half digging, disappearing under the snow in a single controlled dive. The surface rose and fell behind it like a wave moving through powder. It was gone again. Not retreating. Repositioning. The ice beneath them had become a moving floor. Orlov's mouth was dry. He looked at their camp. Tent partially collapsed, gear scattered, dog line gone, smoke residue still on the wind. And he understood the deeper consequence of burning the dogs. They hadn't removed a scent beacon. They had removed mobility. Without dogs, they couldn't outrun anything. They couldn't even move quickly enough to avoid a creature that attacked from underneath. Krudov sat down in the snow, suddenly empty. Nygaard stared at the tent and said, almost to himself, "It wanted us out." Orlov nodded. "Yes," he said, "it wanted us standing on the open ice. Because inside a tent, men have cover, fabric, poles, a structure. Outside, they are shapes against white. They are vibrations. They are heat. They are easy to read." They spent the day rebuilding with shaking hands. Not because rebuilding would save them, Orlov knew it wouldn't, but because without shelter, The cold would end the story faster than the bear ever could. They raised the tent again, double-staked, and moved it 10 yards to hard-packed ground near the pressure ridge where the snow was shallower. Nygaard wanted to march immediately. Orlov refused. "Not without a signal window," he said. "Not without bearings." Durov nodded grimly. "Radio might give us one chance tonight." Krutov didn't speak at all. He worked like a man doing penance. As afternoon faded, Durov set up the radio. He cranked power until his arms shook. He adjusted the coil and listened. At first only static. Then faintly, a voice, far distorted, not intelligible enough to trust. Durov leaned close, trying to pull meaning out of noise. Then the headphones filled with something else. Not a voice. A low, rhythmic sound under the static. A slow breathing. Inhale, exhale. So deep it seemed impossible for a human chest. Durov tore the headphones off as if burned. Nygaard stared at him. "What?" Durov's eyes were wide. "Something S on the line," he whispered. Orlov felt cold spread through him. He wanted to say it was interference. He wanted to say the Arctic plays tricks with radio. But the timing was wrong. The breathing in the headphones had matched the breathing beneath the tent floor. It matched the huff outside the canvas. It felt like the same presence translated into another medium. As if the bear wasn't just tracking scent and vibration. As if the Arctic itself, ice, air, wire, had become a single connected system the creature could move through. Nygaard swallowed hard. "We leave," he said. Orlov nodded once. "Yes," he said. "Tonight if we can, tomorrow if we must." Krutov finally spoke, voice flat and ruined. "And where do we go," he asked, "without dogs?" Orlov looked toward the horizon. Franz Josef land didn't offer routes, only directions. And directions are meaningless if the ground beneath you can move. "We go to the hard ridges," Orlov said. "We stay off deep drift. We keep to pressure ice where it can't swim under us." Nygaard laughed once bitter. "You think it ca?" Orlov didn't answer. Because he remembered the trench Lee. Nay. The sampling holes. The way it had mapped their scent like a survey. A creature that's smart doesn't have one method. It has a toolbox. And now they were walking out into white with nothing but their own heat and the hope that the bear had limits. That night, as they packed, Krutov took one last look at the black mound where the dogs had burned. Not at the ash. At the empty space beside it. The missing dogs weren't just transport. They were noise, they were warning, they were an early alarm. Now the camp would be silent again. And silence, they had learned, belonged to the thing beneath the snow. Orlov tied the last strap, tightened his coat, and spoke the line that closes chapter 2 like a door you can't reopen. "We bought one day," he said. "And we paid with everything that could have carried us out." They left at 21:40. Orlov wrote the time down because writing time down makes you feel like you still own it. The Arctic doesn't care what you call an hour, but men do, especially men who are trying to convince themselves that movement equals control. Nygaard led because he could read pressure ice the way a sailor reads swell. Krutov followed with the load straps. Durov carried the radio pack even though it was dead weight half the time. Orlov brought up the rear with the rifle, and the lantern hooded so low it was barely a coal. They didn't speak after the first 100 yards. Speech would waste breath. Breath would fog and freeze mustaches. Fog would become crystals in eyelashes. And sound, any sound, felt like a flare in the wrong kind of darkness. The pressure ridge ahead was their target. Piled slabs of ice forced up by shifting flows, hard enough that deep snow couldn't blanket it cleanly. If the Behemoth hunted under drift, then ridge ice was the closest thing to rock they had. That was the theory. The Arctic loves theory. It kills you for trusting it. As they approached the ridge, the wind picked up slightly, not a storm, just enough to move surface snow in thin sheets. It wasn't loud, but it was constant. It filled the silence with a hiss that made every other sound harder to separate. If you were there, this is where your body would start bargaining again. If the wind is up, it can't hear us. If the snow is moving, it can't smell us. If the ridge is hard, it can't swim beneath us. And then your mind would remember the tent stakes sliding out as if by fingers. You'd remember the radio breathing. You'd remember the dog vanishing under snow like the ground opened and closed. And the bargain would turn sour in your mouth. Because you'd realize you don't know what rules it obeys. Only what rules it's already broken. They reached the ridge by 23:10. The ice rose in jagged plates, blue-black in the lantern's low glow. Snow had collected in pockets between slabs, but the surface was mostly hard, scoured, and irregular. Nygaard turned back, breath steaming, and whispered, "Here, stay on the hard." Orlov nodded. Krudov looked out over the ridge line and said nothing, but his eyes moved constantly, down, not up. He wasn't scanning the horizon for a bare silhouette. He was scanning the ice beneath his feet, because that was where the Behemoth had taught them to look. They began moving along the ridge's spine, stepping from slab to slab, careful not to slip into the pockets of snow where a leg could catch. And for 40 minutes, nothing happened. No trench, no huff, no breathing under the ice. Just the sound of boots on hard ice and the faint clink of harness buckles. It felt briefly like escape. And that's when Orlov understood the most dangerous thing about their situation. Relief is a kind of noise. It loosens you. It makes your shoulders drop. It makes your attention wander. It makes you stop listening like your life depends on it. The Arctic punishes looseness, the way it punishes exposed skin. At 00:03, Durov stopped and raised a hand. The gesture was automatic, military, not scientific. Nygaard froze, Krudov froze, Orlov froze. Durov pointed to the ridge slab ahead. Orlov stepped closer, lantern still hooded, and saw what Durov had seen. A hairline crack. Fresh. Not the ancient stress fractures that spider through pressure ice. This was a new line, clean and dark, running across the slab like a knife score. And beside it, a second line parallel. 2. As if something had pressed up from below and shifted the plates against each other. Nygaard crouched and pressed his gloved hand to the crack. He pulled his hand back quickly. "Warm," he whispered. Orlov felt his throat tighten. Warmth in ice means friction or breath, and nothing in that world should be breathing under a pressure ridge. Krudov's voice came out flat, tired, as if he'd stopped being surprised hours ago. "It followed," he said. Nygaard shook his head. "It can't be under the ridge, too hard." Krudov didn't argue. He only pointed at the crack. "It doesn't need to be under it," he said. "It needs to be under the snow beside it." Orlov looked to the ridge's flank. A sloping apron of drifted snow ran down into flat white. Soft country. The kind of country that swallows tents and dogs. Nygaard stood. "Keep going," he said, but his voice wasn't confident. It was an order spoken over doubt. They continued, stepping faster now, as if speed could outpace a thing that didn't tire. At 00:21, the ridge started to answer. Not with a roar, not with dramatic collapse. With small things. A faint tremor underfoot felt more than heard. A soft settling sound from the drift flank, like snow compressing under a slow-moving weight. Then a single deep huff, far enough away to be uncertain, close enough to be real. Orlov stopped breathing. He listened. The huff came again, slightly closer, and it W. As of the sound of an animal panting from exertion. It was the sound of a body controlling its breath. An old bear does that when it wants to be silent. An old bear does that when it doesn't want you to hear it coming. Nygaard whispered, "Don't look down the flank." Orlov almost laughed, because what else could you do but look? But he understood. Looking down was how you lost your footing. Looking down was how you stopped moving forward. Looking down was how you became a stationary shape on white. And the behemoth had shown them it preferred stationary. So they kept forward, eyes ahead, as if the ridge line was the only thing in the world. They made it another half-mile before the first man went down. It wasn't an attack. It was a misstep. One of the general hands, Stas, if the handwriting in the record is correct, caught his boot edge on a hidden lip of ice and slid sideways into a drift pocket. His leg plunged knee-deep, then thigh-deep, and he fell hard on his side. The impact wasn't loud, but it was enough. In the drift flank below them, the snow puffed upward as if exhaling. A long, shallow bulge ran through the drift like a wave. It moved toward Stas' position, fast enough that Orlov's brain couldn't pretend it was wind. Nygaard shouted, "UP, up on the slabs." Orlov grabbed Stas' harness and hauled. Stas scrambled, panicking, trying to find purchase. His glove slipped on ice. The bulge in the drift reached the ridge edge. Then the snow split, not into a clean hole, but into a brief opening like a mouth forced apart by a head pushing through. The polar bear behemoth erupted out of the drift flank. Not fully, not like a charging animal on land. Half out, half still anchored in snow like a swimmer breaching. Its head and shoulders were massive, fur crusted with powder, muzzle long. Its eyes locked onto Stas, not with frenzy but with decision. Stas screamed, one sharp sound, and that sound ended in a wet choke when the bear's jaws closed around his pack strap, not his body. It yanked him sideways like he weighed nothing. Orlov fired. The shot hit fur and made a dull puff of snow dust. The bear didn't release. Nygaard fired too. The bear's head jerked slightly, then steadied. Krutov grabbed Stas' arm. For a second, the man was held between human hands and a mouth that didn't care. Then the bear pulled again, and Stas slid across ice into the drift edge like a sack. His boots kicked, his nails scraped. Orlov will later write that this was when he understood the bear was not fighting. It was retrieving. The bear dipped backward into the drift with Stas held in its bite. Snow flowed over its shoulders like water, and both vanished under the surface again. No blood. No torn clothing left behind. Just a sudden empty space. A harness strap snapped, and a drift settling closed over them as if the Arctic had never been disturbed. The ridge went silent. The men stood frozen, rifles raised at nothing. If you were there, you'd feel something that isn't in most horror stories. Not terror. Humiliation. Because you'd realize the bear had taken a man, without needing to stand on the surface for more than 3 seconds. It had minimized its exposure. It had made your bullets irrelevant by making your target temporary. Nygaard's voice came out rough. "It can do that all day," he said. Orlov didn't answer. Krutov stared at the drift like a man staring at an open grave that has closed itself. Then he whispered, "Now it's fed." Orlov felt cold enter his chest. Because fed predators don't always leave. Fed predators sometimes become bolder. Fed predators sometimes decide to do more than eat. They decide to remove the problem permanently. They moved again, faster now, no longer pretending they could manage anything. Orlov wanted to stop to write down the coordinates, to mark the place Stas disappeared, because science insists on records. Nygaard grabbed his sleeve. "No," Nygaard said, "if you stop you become next." So Orlov walked. And in walking, he started to understand the real reason the dogs had been burned. It wasn't only about smell. It was about time. Dogs give you speed, dogs give you distance, dogs let you outrun a slow pursuit. Without them, the bear didn't need to sprint. It only needed to pick the moment a man slipped. It only needed to wait for fatigue to create error. And fatigue always wins. At 0112, the wind dropped completely. The hiss stopped. Silence returned so sharply, it felt like a door closing. Durov froze and turned his head, listening. Orlov saw the change in his face. "What?" Orlov whispered. Durov swallowed. "Breathing," he said. "Not above. Not ahead. Beneath." A slow rhythm you could feel through the ridge slabs if you stood still long enough. Nygaard's jaw clenched. "Don't stand still," he mouthed. But the ridge forced pauses. Each step required balance. And in one of those half-second pauses, the ridge huttered lightly beneath Orlov's boot. A tremor. Then a soft crack sound, like ice plates rubbing. Nygaard pointed ahead. The ridge narrowed into a choke between two higher piles of slabs, a natural corridor where moving off to the sides meant stepping into drift. A funnel. Exactly the kind of geometry the Behemoth preferred. Orlov's mouth went dry. Because he recognized the pattern from the trench line around camp. It wasn't chasing randomly. It was routing them. Making the safe ground lead into a corridor where every step was predictable. Nygaard stopped at the choke and looked back at the others. "We go through fast," he whispered. "No stops." Krudov's eyes were hollow. "It wants us there," he said. Orlov nodded because yes, of course it did. But what else was there? You can't outmap a predator in its own environment. You can only choose which trap you're willing to enter. They went through. Halfway into the choke, the bear surfaced again. Not behind them. Ahead. It burst up out of drift on the far side, using snow like surf, head and shoulders rising into view. It stood higher than any bear Orlov had seen in his life, forequarters enormous, fur hanging in clumps of ice. It didn't roar. It didn't lunge. It simply stood there and watched them approach, as if it had moved ahead to close the route. Nygaard fired immediately. 2 shots. One hit shoulder, one hit neck. Puffs of first no. Minimal reaction. The bear lowered its head slightly and huffed. The huff rolled across the choke like a pressure wave, making Orlov's lungs feel too small. Krudov whispered, "It's telling us to stop." Orlov didn't know if that was true. But he knew what the bear's posture meant. It wasn't afraid of rifles. It was managing distance. Then slowly the bear stepped sideways, one pace onto deeper drift. And sank. Not falling, not collapsing. Sinking as if the snow were water, swallowing its mass smoothly. In 2 seconds, it was gone again beneath the surface, leaving only a disturbed drift mound. Nygaard stared in disbelief. "It can choose," he whispered. Orlov felt the trap tighten another notch. The bear could surface where it wanted, vanish when it wanted, and use snow like a second ocean. It wasn't just powerful. It was 3-dimensional. And humans in the Arctic are painfully 2-dimensional. You walk on top, and if top fails, you die. Durov whispered, "We go around." Nygaard shook his head. "Around is drift," he said, "and drift is where it lives." Orlov closed his eyes for 1 second, an impossible luxury, and then opened them. "We keep moving," he said. "We don't give it a stop." He didn't believe his own words. He just needed them to be spoken. At 0200, they reached the first sign of something human. Not a person. A thing. A black shape in the snow. The top of an old supply cache marker, half buried, likely placed by a previous expedition. A cairn. A fixed point. The kind of thing that tells you other humans have been here and thought it mattered enough to leave a sign. Nygaard moved toward it and brushed snow away. Underneath were boards, weathered, stamped with old Cyrillic. A cache. Maybe food, maybe fuel, maybe an old tent. Orlov's heart lifted slightly. Not hope, just the relief of touching anything that wasn't snow and death. Nygaard pried the boards up with his knife. Inside were empty tins and a half-rotted canvas roll. Nothing useful. A place that had already been stripped. Or never stocked. Or stocked and ruined. The Arctic doesn't preserve everything. Sometimes it rots things slowly in cold moisture, leaving you a mockery of supplies. Nygaard swore softly. Orlov stared at the empty cache and felt something break behind his ribs. Because he realized what the bear had been doing since camp. It wasn't just hunting them. It was hunting their options. It had removed the dogs. It had forced them onto ridges. It had rooted them into chokes. Now even the human markers, the things meant to anchor survival, were empty. If the world were designed, it would feel designed for their failure. Krudov looked down at the boards. "There's a reason," he said. Orlov frowned. "Reason?" Krudov nodded once. "A bear doesn't kill like this unless it's old," he said, "or unless it's learned men are slow." Nygaard looked at him sharply. "What are you saying?" Krudov's voice stayed flat. "I'm saying we taught it," he said. Orlov felt nausea. Because yes, dogs, smoke, tents, rope tension, the rhythm of their watches. They had been teaching it since the first day. And now it wasn't improvising. It was repeating what had worked. They didn't last much longer after the cache. Exhaustion began to show in small failures. A strap not tightened properly, a glove dropped, a stumble corrected too slowly. At 02:41, Durov stopped walking and sagged slightly. Orlov turned. "What?" he whispered. Durov's eyes were wide. "The radio," he said. "Listen." Orlov frowned. "It's dead." Durov shook his head. "I can hear it," he whispered. Nygaard stepped closer. Durov lifted the headset from the pack and pressed it to his own ear, then held the other cup toward Orlov. Orlov hesitated, then took it. At first only static. Then beneath the static, a slow, deep rhythm. Breathing. Not crackle, not atmospheric hum. Breathing, as if someone were exhaling into the line. Orlov's blood went cold. He ripped the headset away and threw it into the snow as if it were contaminated. Nygaard stared at him. Orlov swallowed hard and said the truth that made no sense and yet fit everything. "It's in our signals," he whispered. Nygaard shook his head violently. "No." Orlov pointed at the snow around them. "It's under us. It's around us," he said. "And now it's in the only thing we have that reaches beyond us." Durov's mouth trembled. Krudov looked at the discarded headset and whispered, "It hears through wires." Nygaard spat. "That's madness." Orlov looked into the white and felt something settle. Not belief, but acceptance that the Arctic had become one continuous medium for this predator: snow, air, rope, and metal. Whether the breathing on the radio was real or their minds breaking didn't matter. The effect was the same. They were trapped inside a system that answered back. And that is the definition of a hierarchy you can't exit. They stopped at 03:10, not by decision but by failure. Nygaard's knee buckled briefly on an uneven slab, and he went down on one hand, catching himself. The sound of glove on hard ice was small. But in the stillness, it was enough. The drift flank beside them puffed upward and exhaled. Then another puff further along, like a body moving under the surface. Orlov's heart hammered. "Up," he hissed. "Stay up." Nygaard got to his feet. Then the behemoth surfaced directly beside the ridge flank, almost parallel to them. Not in front, not behind. Beside. Its head rose out of drift like a pale boulder emerging from water. Its mouth opened slightly. A thick, wet breath rolled out. And then it did something the men hadn't seen it do before. It held itself in place, half in drift, half out, as if it was demonstrating that it could choose to remain present now. It could afford it. It had already taken a man. It had already forced the rest into fatigue. It was no longer conserving. It was closing. Nygaard fired point-blank into the head. The shot struck and made a heavy thump. The bear's muzzle jerked an inch. Then it continued rising, ignoring the cost. Krudov lifted his rifle too, hands shaking, and fired. Orlov fired. 3 shots in quick succession. The bear finally recoiled slightly, not collapsing, but dipping back into drift like a swimmer ducking under a wave. Then it vanished under the snow again. Nygaard gasped, "It feels it, just not enough." Orlov looked at the ridge. He looked at the drift. He looked at the darkness of the horizon where there was no camp now, no dogs, no return. And he made a decision so bleak it felt like a confession. "We don't stop again," he said. "Not for rest, not for prayer, not for anything." Krudov stared at him. "You can't command bodies," Krudov whispered. "Bodies stop." Orlov didn't argue, because Krudov was right. Bodies stop. And predators that wait for bodies to stop are the most efficient predators in nature. So Orlov did the only thing he could do to buy time. He ordered them to drop weight. They cut loose non-essential gear, spare tins, extra cloth, anything that made them slower. Durov wanted to keep the radio pack. Orlov grabbed it and shoved it into the snow. "No," he said. "If it reaches back to us, it can reach to them. We walk silent." Durov looked like he'd been punched, but he let it go. They moved. And in the hours before gray dawn, they became nothing but motion and breath and pain. They reached the coastal edge by late morning, ice thinning into rubble floes, the open lead water visible in dark strips between plates. Nygaard recognized the line and pointed. "Here," he said, "we can get to the old landing point, if the sea hasn't broken it." Orlov's chest tightened. Sea meant possible rescue. Sea also meant the worst kind of vulnerability, open leads where ice is thin, where a heavy body under surface could move faster than men can run. Krutov looked down at the lead water. He whispered, "It will come here." Orlov nodded. "Yes," he said, "because we're here." They didn't see the bear again. That was the last cruelty. It didn't need to show itself anymore. Its presence had already been installed in their nervous systems. Every step on thin ice felt like stepping on a lid. Every dark lead looked like a mouth. They reached the landing point at noon, an old flagged pole barely standing, ice scoured, and a small boat cached under weighted canvas. The boat was damaged but usable. They pushed it toward the lead water, hands new. Mouths open for breath. And in that moment, because the Arctic never lets you do anything cleanly, the snow behind them puffed upward again. A long, shallow bulge raced toward them under the surface like a wave. Nygaard shouted. Krutov turned. Orlov raised the rifle. The bulge reached the edge of the lead water and stopped. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the polar bear behemoth surfaced on the ice lip, not emerging from drift this time, but rising from beneath broken ice as if the sea itself had delivered it. It stood with its forepaws on ice, water streaming off fur. Its head lifted, and it huffed once, deep, thick, almost calm. Orlov realized what the huff was. Not anger, not exertion. Confirmation. This is my boundary too. Nygaard fired. The bear flinched slightly, then lowered its head. Not charging, not rushing, just beginning the approach. Krudov grabbed a flare tin and struck it, one of their last emergency signals. The flare caught with a violent hiss and bright smoke. The bear hesitated. Not afraid of light exactly, annoyed by it, avoiding direct irritant. Orlov used the hesitation. "Boat," he snapped, "now." They shoved the boat into the lead and climbed in, awkward and shaking. Nygaard pushed with an oar. The boat scraped free. Behind them the bear stepped closer, paws cracking ice. It didn't need to leap. It only needed to be present long enough for the lead to become unsafe. Orlov held the flare high until his arm shook, smoke streaming. The bear halted at the ice edge, watching. Not defeated. Not denied. Just unwilling to commit into open water, where its under-snow advantage turned into something else. It huffed again. Then slowly, it sank beneath the ice lip, disappearing into broken water and slush as if the sea had taken it back. No thrash. No splash. A controlled withdrawal. Orlov stared at the spot where it vanished and felt something worse than relief. He felt certainty that it could surface again any time it chose. They rowed until their arms failed. Then they drifted. Then, hours later, they were found by a seal-hunting vessel working the edge of the ice. The hunters pulled them aboard without questions at first, because in the Arctic you don't ask for a story until the living are warm enough to tell it. Orlov's record ends the way mature records often end. Not with a climax, with a line that tries to be clinical and fails. It reads in translation like this: dogs destroyed by fire for safety, one man lost in ice event, predator engaged, withdrawal successful. The word bear appears only once, and it is underlined in a later hand, as if someone reading Orlov's notes wanted to remind themselves that they were supposed to be dealing with something ordinary. And then there is a second note, written by a different person, likely in an administrative office far from the ice. Recommend future parties avoid inland pressure ridges in that sector until further assessment. No mention of dogs burned alive. No mention of a body moving under snow like water. No mention of breathing on the radio. Because the Arctic is good at one thing besides killing. It erases. It turns evidence into weather. It turns tracks into drift. It turns men into missing inventory. And if you're still listening now, let the final thought land where it belongs. They burned their dogs to hide a scent. But in doing so, they removed the only living alarm they had. They removed the only speed they had. They removed the only warmth that moved. They did it for safety. And the Arctic accepted the offering the way it accepts all offerings. Quietly, and without promising it will ever be enough.